Welcome to episode 21 of Real Health Radio.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Real Health Radio. This is Chris Sandel. And on today's show, it's another one where it's just me on my own, and the topic that I'm going to be covering is beliefs. And our beliefs are so important for how we experience the world, and understanding how and why beliefs are formed and how we can change them is something I work on a lot with clients. And a lot of the content for this show is from a guest lecture that I did for Isabel Fox and Duke's Stop Fighting Food program. It's a program that not only have I given a guest lecture for, but I'm also going through myself. And I really can't recommend it highly enough. I'm really impressed with what Isabel's put together, and I've learned a lot that I'm able to use with clients. So I'll be putting a link in the show notes. And yeah, as I said, I highly recommend the program. So while the focus for this week's episode about beliefs is largely going to be about people's relationship with food and body image, most of the examples that I use as part of this have nothing to do with these things. And this is something that I've intentionally done. And so much of what I work on with clients is understanding their beliefs and behaviors in all facets of their life. And I wanted to use a wide range of examples to help illustrate this. So to start off with, I want to share a story that can help set the frame for why we form beliefs. So Alex Babelis was a psychologist who studied at MIT in the 1940s before going on to be a professor there. He later moved to Stanford University, where he carried out a number of experiments. And for one of the experiments, Babelis built a machine that produced lights and sounds and programmed this machine totally at random. He would then ask the Stanford students to come and sit in the machine and for them to figure out what the pattern was that determined how the lights and the sounds would come on. So each student would sit in the machine, they would then come out and they would have developed a theory. So a set of beliefs about how the machine was programmed. And he would then get the participants to explain their theory about what was going on and how it was programmed. At the end of the experiment, Babelis would then tell all the students that their theories were wrong and the machine was actually totally programmed at random. And the students would normally respond with disbelief. And not only was there disbelief, but the more complex the theory that the student had developed, the more intensely he or she attempted to refute Babelis and insist that their theory was correct. And I like to use this study as an example, as it helps to demonstrate that there's a basic human need to develop a set of beliefs about why things are the way that they are. And once these beliefs are developed, it's often very difficult to let them go. And even in the face of overwhelming evidence that we are doing something that isn't working or that our beliefs are incorrect, we often vehemently defend them. And every moment of every day, we're exposed to an inordinate amount of information and stimuli. We can't possibly process all of this. So at an unconscious level, our brains start to prioritize what is and isn't important and what they should be showing us. It's trying to filter out and expose us only to the most important stuff. And to help with this process, it then makes total sense for our brains to start to make assumptions and for it to make connections. And these assumptions and connections are shortcut ways for us to understand the world and not be overwhelmed by information. So basically, beliefs help us to quickly and easily make sense of the world that we live in. And if we think about this from an evolutionary perspective, it helps to explain this even more. So imagine you're an early human living in nature. You're walking around the forest and you hear a rustle in the bushes. From a life and death perspective, it makes sense for us to make the connection that a rustle in the bushes equals a dangerous predator, to make the connection that A equals B. Because if we're right, we manage to get away and we manage to evade that predator. And if we're wrong, then we've still avoided some potential harm. So making the assumption that the rustle in the bushes is a dangerous predator when it turns out to be just the wind or something totally harmless is known as a false positive. So you incorrectly assumed that there was a connection between two things when there was no connection. But looking at it the other way around, imagine you hear a rustle in the bushes and you assume that it is nothing, and then a predator jumps out and attacks you. In this situation, this is known as a false negative. You assume that there was no connection between two events when there really was a connection between them. And as a species, it makes much more sense from an evolutionary perspective to create false positives than false negatives. So that is, it makes more sense for us to find patterns that exist that aren't true than for us to ignore patterns that are true. And this process is known as patternicity, and it's the tendency to find meaningful patterns in both meaningful and meaningless data. And an important part of this is the order of sequence with beliefs. And beliefs come first, and then the explanation for the beliefs comes second. So our perception of reality is dependent on the beliefs that we hold about it. So we have a belief and then we filter the world and the information around us so that it means that that belief then becomes correct. And there's a famous quote by George Orwell that states, "Myths which are believed in tend to become true." And this is really important and is something I'm going to come back to when you look at how you can go about changing your beliefs. And beliefs are a blending of logic and emotion. So we are rational beings, but we're also emotional beings. And an emotional leap of faith beyond reason is often required just to make it through the day, let alone making big decisions in life. So as a simple example of this, imagine standing in the food aisle looking at jars of jam or mayonnaise or soy sauce, and if you had to make a purely logical choice about which one to pick, you'd be standing there for a very long time trying to make that decision. But by involving emotion, you're able to make a choice based on, say, the one that you've always eaten in your household, or the one that you tried when you went out to a restaurant, or because you saw a TV advertisement for it. None of these rationally explain why this is the right pick, but through emotions you're able to make that choice. And beliefs are also largely about control, and feelings of control are essential for our well-being. We think clearer, we make better decisions when we feel that we are in control. So lacking control is highly aversive, and one fundamental way to really bolster our control is to understand what's going on. So we instinctively seek out patterns to gain control, even if those patterns are illusionary. And despite the fact that seeking control is an evolutionary characteristic, this doesn't always mean that it is the best thing to do. And I'm a big fan of the work of Tony Robbins, and he talks about the fact that what we get out of life is in direct proportion to how much we can be okay with uncertainty and vulnerability and being out of control. And the more that you have to have control in every outcome, the smaller your life will be. So hopefully this gives you a bit of a basic idea about why our beliefs are formed and why from an evolutionary perspective they've been so important. So next I want to look at the how process, so how beliefs are actually formed. And I don't want to get into the real technical side of this in terms of looking at different brain regions or how beliefs are formed in that sense. But beliefs are formed or are created in the same regions as memories. And just like memories, beliefs are stronger or intensified when they're linked to emotional states. So the first way that beliefs are formed is through events that happen in our life. So we are in a car accident, we eat certain food and we get sick, we're picked first or we're picked last in gym class, we went to a private school or our parents struggled to have money or keep down a job. All of these life events have an impact on our beliefs about the world around us or who we are. But what's interesting with this is it's not the events or the experience as much as what we tell ourselves about those events or those experiences and what they mean. You can have two people go through the exact same event, but have very different meanings that they take from it. So using a car accident example, one person could be in a car accident, they tell themselves that they were just really unlucky, they walk away from it, and the next day they get into a car and there's no problem at all. You can have then a second person who's in the exact same car accident who tells themselves that they were only inches away from dying. They make the decision that they were lucky, but they're just not going to take that chance ever again. And from now on, they don't want to ride in a car. So you have the exact same incident, someone taking a totally different meaning from it. And this then leads on to the next way that beliefs are formed, which are what you say to yourself. So the words that you utter in your head sort of non-stop each day has a huge impact on our beliefs. So imagine you're in the street and you see a mother just having a meltdown on this small child that you think is their son or their daughter. And she's telling this child that there's such a disappointment, that he or she was a mistake, that they can never do anything right, that why can't they be more like their brother or their sister, that they're just such a failure. So this mother is having these really nasty and horrible stuff to say to that little child, and it's just going on and on. As you watch that scenario, how do you think that little girl or that little boy is feeling? My estimation is that they're feeling pretty crappy about themselves. And it's easy for us to make that connection or make that assumption and realize that they're going to be feeling pretty bad. But how come when people do this to themselves, they expect different results? People talk to themselves like this all the time. They then have low self-esteem and negative beliefs about themselves, and they wonder why it's going on. And it's not just what you say to yourself, but also the memories and the events that you focus on. The memories and the events that you choose to replay can have a big impact on how you perceive the world and the beliefs that are going to come as part of this. So if you show a 7-year-old child a horror film before bed, the chances are exponentially higher that they're going to have a nightmare, they're going to wake up and they're going to believe someone is under their bed or that is hiding in their closet. And the same thing happens to us based on the movies that we show to ourselves repeatedly within our mind. So what we see, hear, and read is going to impact on the beliefs that we form. If we, for example, live in a religious household where your father is a minister, your parents are always talking about scriptures and religion, then it's infinitely more likely that you're going to be religious yourself and believe in whatever religion your parents are part of. And same thing based on political beliefs. So if you spend your days looking at health blogs and reading diet books, you're going to be much more likely to form beliefs around food and calories and weight loss than someone who is not actively participating in these behaviours. And I know this may sound obvious, but I find it amazing how baffled people can be about why they hold certain beliefs. And then we chat about this stuff and we find that they're constantly exposing themselves to sources that would perpetuate these kind of ideas. And this then leads on to the next way that beliefs are formed, which are cultural reasons. The culture that we live in has a huge impact on your belief system. And it's really easy to see this by looking at cultures around the world or looking at tribes around the world. In tribes in Thailand, women wear brass rings stacked around their neck to elongate the neck. And the longer neck is seen as sexier and a sexier woman in this culture. In Ethiopia or in certain tribes in Ethiopia, they put scars on the belly, and these scars are considered attractive and sexy. For women in the Maasai tribe, they will elongate their earlobes. And again, this is in that tribe considered sexy. In Mauritania, in Africa, being big and heavy and having stretch marks is what is in and is what is most prized for women. So they send girls as young as 7 off to fat camps, and not like fat camps in a lot of the rest of the world. These are fat camps to actually fatten them up, and it's the equivalent of them being like foie gras ducks, and they're force-fed food. And I would imagine that as you hear me talk about this stuff, all of these things appear strange and unsexy to you, and you may even be sort of repulsed and think, why would anyone be wanting to do this to themselves? And the reason is because you haven't grown up in a place that values this and tells you how important this is. And I would imagine that if we went to those tribes and we told them what we do as a culture for things that are sexy or what we value, etc., they would not really understand it. And they wouldn't understand it because as a culture, it's not highly valued for them. And not only are beliefs about a culture, but beliefs are also highly contextual. And they're much more fluid than people really think they are. And different scenarios can have different beliefs or can at least have you act differently than you would normally think you would based on your stated beliefs. And I'll give a couple of examples of this because, again, I think it's a really important concept to get. In 1971, Stanford University ran an experiment that was to become famous. And known as the Stanford Prison Experiment, there were 24 participants who were arbitrarily split into two groups with 12 role-playing as guards and 12 role-playing as prisoners. And all the participants, whether they ended up playing a guard or ended up playing a prisoner, consider themselves to be pacifists and non-violent types. And they were your quintessential hippies at the time. And if you look at the photos, they all had the long hair and really looked like hippies at that time and very much identified as that. And the experiment was meant to last for 2 weeks, and it wanted to investigate the mental and emotional changes that a person goes through when they are a prisoner. And the experiment is described in great detail in the book The Lucifer Effect by Philip Zimbardo, and he was actually the person who ran that experiment. And it's a really harrowing read of a book. And in a very little space of time, what started out as role-playing turned into real life. So the guards took to their new positions with brutality. And so there was lots of physical and mental abuse. The prisoners became insular, and it was like this accelerated course in learned helplessness. So they either became robots and were blindly following the guards' requests, or they began to rebel, so trying to escape. They were going on hunger strikes within a very short space of time. And the experiment, as I said, was meant to last 2 weeks, but they actually stopped it after 6 days when 3 of the prisoners had already been released early due to having mental breakdowns. And despite all being pacifists and non-violent types, the setting and the situations changed all of this in a very short space of time. And they adopted to the roles of what they believed a guard or a prisoner should be like and looked to the behaviour of others for what was appropriate within that setting. And the book then goes on to further review the situation in Abu Ghraib prison, where prisoners were tortured and photos were taken of them in very depraved behaviours. And it was like history repeating itself, but without someone pulling the plug after 6 days. So despite what your stated beliefs may be aware of the environment and how that can impact on your beliefs and how you act. And this can also happen based on physiology and what's happening in the body at certain times. And there was an interesting study done in Israel on judges who presided over parole hearings. And the paper looked at 1,000 rulings that were made in 2009 by 8 different judges. And while the judgment should have been based on the facts of the case, they actually found something rather interesting. They found that the likelihood of a favourable ruling peaked at the beginning of the day. It would then steadily decline over time from a probability of about 65% to nearly 0, and then would spike back up again to about 65% once they had had a break or they'd had a meal or they'd had a snack. So basically, if the judges were full and had good energy, a favourable judgment was likely. As time went on and they became hungry and in low energy, they saw the defendants in a different light and a much more negative light. And there was a great article that I read a number of years ago called "Sorry for the Things I Said When I Was Hungry." And it was very funny, but it's also very true. And our physiology can have a huge impact on our beliefs and the way we see a situation. And things like hunger and where we are in terms of hunger can really impact on this stuff. Another important influencer on belief is a concept known as stereotype threat. And stereotype threat is a situational predicament in which people are at risk of confirming to negative stereotypes about their social group. So let me give an example so you can better understand what I mean by this. So there is a widely known stereotype in this society that women have less ability in mathematics than men. And in the literature, a general pattern has begun to emerge that women perform roughly the same as men, except when the test material becomes quite advanced. And when that happens, and when I say the test material becomes quite advanced, I'm talking specifically about mathematics, that when it becomes advanced, that women then do worse on those tests. So there was an experiment done in 1998 to see if this could be due to stereotype threat or if this was actually true within reality. And so they did a number of experiments as part of this, but I just want to talk about the final one. So in the final test, they had two groups that were given a very difficult maths test, and both groups contained a mix of men and women. And before starting the test, one of the groups was told that there was no gender difference on the test, that men and women performed equally well. For the other group, the subjects were given no information about gender differences on the test, just that it was a hard maths test. And the results. In the group that were where there was no mention about gender differences, women did worse than men. In the test where everyone told that no gender differences were seen when the tests were run previously, the men and women performed equally well. And this study suggests that women's math performances improved when stereotype threat was decreased, i.e. they were told there was no difference between men and women in terms of the results. And while this was focusing just on math, how many other areas of life could this also be applied to? Societal beliefs about what men or women or specific sections of society, like different races or classes, can massively skew someone's performance or outcome, even if this is totally at a subconscious level. And there's a fascinating tool called the Implicit Association Test, or IAT, and it's available on the Harvard website, and I'll link to it in the show notes. And it looks at our implicit beliefs across a whole range of different things. And implicit beliefs are the beliefs that run counter to what we say our beliefs really are. And Malcolm Gladwell talks about this in his book Blink, where he looks at a number of these tests. And the one I want to comment on is the one to do with race. So the way that the test works is that you have two columns with heading on them, and you then have a list of words underneath these columns, and you have to move the words into the correct column. So an easy example of this would be that you have two columns, one is headed male, one is headed female, and then you have a list of names. So John, Mary, Stephen, Sarah. You then have to move the words into the appropriate column. And in this example, it's obviously going to be fairly easy, especially with the names that I've given there. They're normally just names that are associated with one gender. Obviously, if you're having names that are associated with both genders, and you can have people who are called Joe for both male and female, then it becomes more difficult. But if it's purely names associated with one gender, it's going to be very easy for you to move that into the right column. And so as part of the test, you're advised to do it as quickly as possible. And it's the speed at which you could do this that is looked at to see if you have implicit biases. So the faster you can do it versus the slower you can do it helps them to make judgments about implicit biases. So with the example about names, it's going to be really easy to move them into the right columns. But things get a little more interesting when you do the test on race. So again, you've got these two columns, but instead of having just one word in each of the title, like male or female, there are a number of words. So on the top of one of the columns, it says European American or bad, while on the top of the other column, it says African American or good. So that's one column with European American or bad, and the second column with African American or good. So underneath you then have a list of words like hurt, evil, glorious, wonderful, and then different photos of black and white people. And like the first test, you then have to move those photos or those words into the correct column. Now, as you can imagine with this, it becomes much more difficult. You now have to slow down people start assigning things to the wrong columns. You notice how much more difficult it is and how much more you have to concentrate when doing it. And then you get part 2 of the test. And this time the 2 columns are European American or good, and then African American or bad. And you're then given the exact same list of words and pictures that you then have to move into either of the columns. And Gladwell, who took the test, then describes that it was at this stage that his mortification grew stronger. While the first test was a real struggle, he now had no trouble doing the second test. He didn't have any trouble computing African American or bad in one column the way that he did when it was European American or bad. And I just want to point out that Malcolm Gladwell is half black. His mother is Jamaican. And in fact, more than 80% of people who take this test end up having pro-white associations. And this is important because you have beliefs on 2 levels. You have your conscious attitudes, which are those that you state as your beliefs. And then you have your unconscious beliefs. And those are the things that you don't consciously choose, but are there underneath. So if something is then happening at a conscious, unconscious level, is there a way to then change these beliefs? Well, it turns out that there is. So to quote Gladwell, you can take the race IAT test as many times as you want and try as hard as you want to respond faster to the more problematic categories, and it won't make any difference. But believe it or not, if before you take the IAT, I were to ask you to look over a series of pictures or articles about people like Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela or Colin Powell, your reaction time changes. Suddenly, it won't be so hard to associate positive things with black people. Our first impressions or our unconscious decisions are generated by our experiences and by our environment. And we can change this by changing the experiences that comprise these impressions. And this is something I'm going to come back to in a little bit when we look at in more detail how to go about changing beliefs. So the final idea that I want to mention about belief formation is that beliefs are often formed in chunks. And that is that one belief can create a whole host of other beliefs without very much thinking. So what do I mean by this? If you're someone who decides that you're going to get into alternative health, there's probably a load of beliefs that come along with this. So you believe in organic farming, you're against GMOs, you believe in homeopathy, in herbal medicine, you have a suspicion about doctors or big pharma, you're against vaccinations. And even if without proper investigation into any of these or all of these, you form opinions about these areas based on the belief of, I'm getting into alternative health. And while it might not be the case for all of these different categories, if someone is getting into an alternative health or says that they're into alternative health, but the majority of the assumptions that I've made here are going to be correct. US politics is another easy example of this. If someone says that they are a Democrat or they're a Republican, you're instantly able to make a whole host of assumptions based on their beliefs in that party. So whether it be about guns, whether it be about immigration, whether it be about welfare, etc. Just by knowing someone belongs to a particular political party, you can make assumptions about their beliefs. And people's allegiance to a party can then impact on their beliefs. And social psychologist Jeffrey Cohen discovered that Democrats were much more accepting of a welfare program that they believed to be proposed by a fellow Democrat, even if the proposal came from a Republican and is quite restrictive. And equally, Republicans were far more likely to approve a generous welfare program if they thought that it was proposed by a fellow Republican. So people have huge biases that affect their stated beliefs. And the supporting information that you choose to agree with or disagree with is dependent on those biases or your pre-existing beliefs. So that's my list for how beliefs are formed. And obviously this isn't an exhaustive list, but I tried to pick ideas or examples that I felt were the most relevant. So now on to then the most important part, which is how you can change beliefs. So the simplest and most straightforward suggestion to change a belief is just to pick a new belief. We get to choose what things we believe in. And because beliefs come first and the evidence comes second, we will then find evidence to validate whatever belief we choose. And if this is the case, doesn't it make more sense to pick a belief that is going to be supporting to us? So say, for example, if you have a belief that everyone in the world is out to rip you off, how do you think this will affect the way that you interact with people? Even if someone is nice to you, you'll be suspicious and think that it's a scam and you're just waiting for them to show their true colors. And then when someone does do wrong by you, it's like, see, I was right, and it just further supports your view of the world. Alternatively, if you pick a belief that everyone deep down is good inside, how will this then change your interactions with people in the world? When people are nice, it further supports that theory of yours. And if someone does wrong by you, you chalk it up to them, say, being in a tough place, and you know that in time they'll make amends. I think it's important to understand that beliefs have a direct impact on how we interact with the world and how certain events affect us. For example, think about the idea of weight and whether it's directly within your control. Imagine you believe that weight was 100% within your control. How would then reading an article on dieting affect you? Or if instead you believe that your weight is largely out of control, how would this same article impact on you? In one instance, it may make you want to try and go on a diet, and in the other, it might make you angry and be upset that people are being deluded and sold into a certain message. Or if you read an article by a fat acceptance activist, how would this respond, or how would you respond to this message? If you believe that weight is squarely in your control, then the idea of fat acceptance makes less sense, and it's all about personal responsibility and willpower. Whereas if you believe that our weight isn't 100% within our control or so in our control, then fat acceptance makes more sense, and it would be maybe something you get more behind. So the conversation that's going to be going on in your head while reading those articles or being exposed to something is going to be totally different based on that belief. And in some areas of life, you don't want to just pick a belief that makes you feel good. So say you fall down some stairs and you tear a ligament in your leg, you want to get the best unbiased research about what is your best option, rather than creating a belief of everything will be all right and just doing nothing. But for lots of life, there is no right or wrong belief. There is no black and white. And when this is the case, picking a belief that genuinely serves you the best would be my suggestion. As part of this, then it might be worth you spending some time making an inventory of your current beliefs. So do some journaling or do some free writing on the topic and see what comes up. So write down, so what does it mean, or what do you believe about being fat or being thin, or a woman or a man or a mother or a father, or beliefs about money or beliefs about relationships. And look at your responses and ask yourself, do these beliefs really serve you? And if not, what belief could you replace it with? And obviously this is only going to be dealing with the surface level beliefs and not with your implicit beliefs, but I will go into some other stuff that you can be dealing with to help with those implicit beliefs. And sometimes picking a belief is not really an option. And what I mean by this is someone can understand an idea intellectually, but they can't truly believe it until they experience it. So for most clients, the thought of overcoming a fear around eating a certain food or going to an event or wearing a certain outfit is way more terrifying in their mind than it is in reality. And I've lost count of how many times I've suggested clients do something, it scares the hell out of them just thinking about it, but then they do it and they say how much easier it was. And more often they say that they actually enjoyed the experience, something they never thought would happen. And through this experience, their beliefs are then changed. And too often people try and overthink their way out of a problem, or they feel like they have to be at some certain level of being okay or confident before trying something. But this really stalls progress because most people feel unprepared before trying something new. And the only way to get rid of that feeling is by going through the process and having that feeling disappear because you've been through it. So rather than trying to think your way out of old beliefs, put yourself through the experiences that then create a change in the beliefs. And for me, this is important for two reasons. The first is that by going through this experience, it has a trickle-down effect. So say someone is scared of heights, but they decide that they're going to go rock climbing or give rock climbing a go. And this could be indoors, but they're going to give rock climbing a go. They try it out and they discover that they actually really enjoy rock climbing. They enjoy the experience. And not only do they enjoy it, but it helps them to overcome their fear of heights. And this experience then isn't just about the fear of heights, but it then makes them think, well, if I can overcome this, what else am I capable of? So this one belief starts then shattering other beliefs and other limitations, and it has a trickle-down effect. The other reason is that experiences can often lead to belief changes that couldn't happen without that actual experience. So I talked earlier about the IAT race test and the implicit bias that most people have towards whites over blacks. So how could we make white people more empathetic to black people? So the Royal Holloway University of London and the University of Barcelona did a recent study, and they placed white participants in a virtual reality helmet. And with virtual reality, the researchers were able to create the illusion in which white participants were in the body of someone with darker skin. So people would look at themselves in the mirror, or they'd extend their arms or their hands, and they would see themselves with darker skin. The researchers also used various other ways to trick the participants' minds as part of the research. So one of them, which was called the rubber hand illusion, involved a participant sitting under a blanket at a table with a rubber hand protruding in front of them. Their real hand, meanwhile, was placed to the side, out of view. Both hands were then stroked among sort of other sensory cues, creating the illusion that the hand in front of them was theirs. In another similar part of the experiment, which was called the effacement illusion, the same thing was done, with the participants looking at a screen of a black person while their face was being stroked, and they saw the person on the screen's face also being stroked. So again, it gave the illusion of that they were having that black skin, or they were having that black face, and it was theirs, and they were looking at themselves. And as strange and as weird as all of this sound, it had a huge positive impact. After the experiment, participants' implicit attitudes towards blacks were minimized. They were also more likely to report that the other person's face was more attractive. They were more physically similar to other people of other races, and they said that they were more likely to conform to other person's opinions. And reading and exposing yourself to ideas can help change beliefs, but putting yourself in an actual situation and living and breathing that experience can make a much bigger change. And so another way of changing your belief is to focus on your internal environment. And this is the things that you say to yourself, the things that you focus on, the memories or the future events that you play out in your head. And I'm a big believer that someone's internal environment is directly responsible for how they feel about food and about their body and about the world around them. And so I have an exercise that I do early on with clients if I'm working with them for disordered eating or body image. And I ask them to imagine someone came to them and they wanted to know how to create the same issues around food and insecurities in their body. So rather than what they have being a problem, I want them to imagine that someone wanted to learn those skills from them. So I get them to write down the things that they say to themselves before eating food, during eating, and after eating. I get them to write down what they say to themselves while looking in the mirror or while they're getting dressed. I ask them to list the regular comments that they make to themselves to lead them to feel down or more likely to use food for comfort or to want to restrict food. I get them to describe all the past memories or the future scenarios that are painful that they constantly play themselves in their mind. So they answer all these questions, and we now have then a blueprint for how to make issues around food in their body. And I asked them, if I got someone to follow exactly what they did for 3 months or 6 months, do they think that that person would develop the same issues that they have? And most of them then agree that they think that would happen. So rather than then feel upset about the situation, really it isn't surprising. The way that they talk to themselves and what they focus on has created the most likely outcome, which is how they now feel. So then the second part of the exercise is to create a new blueprint. So I get them to write down how they believe a normal eater thinks before, during, and after a meal. And I use the word normal in inverted commas. How does a normal eater know when they are full? What does someone with a healthy body image say when they look at themselves in the mirror or they're putting on clothes? What event from their past or the future could they constantly play that would change their beliefs about their body or about their life? So what are the positive events or the positive future scenarios that they could be constantly playing to themselves? What are phrases or comments that they could say to themselves that would make them feel more positive? So I then have them have these two blueprints, and I ask them to follow this new blueprint. So even if they don't think it will make a difference, I want them to say these things and focus on these memories and see what happens. And during the time when they are feeling poorly about themselves or about their food choices or their body, I get them to ask themselves, which blueprint are they really following? Are they following the old one or are they following the new one? And old habits die hard, and I don't want to suggest that this is a lovely, seamless, linear process, but the more people can be aware of the things that they're saying to themselves and how this can impact, the more they can catch themselves and change this before it spirals. And the more people consistently keep it up, the more these beliefs will naturally change and the more it becomes a normal, natural habit. And one thing that makes this infinitely easier is changing your external environment. So read books that support the beliefs that you want to have about your body or about food or about what it means to be a man or a woman. Like read autobiographies, listen to different podcasts, follow blogs, constantly expose yourself to new information that it supports these new beliefs. Because our most strongly held implicit beliefs about thinness or race or gender roles are so strong because it's what we are shown every single day. We barely question them or even notice them because they're so ubiquitous and just so everywhere. And the reason we then hold these beliefs is that they're the most obvious answers given the information that we're shown. But if we can change the environment and the information that we present to ourselves on a daily basis through the things that we watch and the things that we read, then changing our beliefs becomes so much easier. The new beliefs are now the most likely outcome based on the new information that you're constantly exposing yourself to. So rather than this appearing radical or extreme, they become the most obvious choices. So that is it for this week's show, and I hope it's given you a better understanding of why we form beliefs, how they're formed, and the ways that you can go about changing them. Please try out some of the suggestions and let me know how you get on. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas and get to have some relaxing time off. I will catch you next week when I have another guest on the show, but until then, take care.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.